Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Outsourcing 101, a guide for first-time outsourcers. I'd like to start off by introducing our speaker, Eric Libros. He's the Senior VP of Operations for Oxys, and he manages our business process outsourcing practice. He's worked with many companies to help them determine if outsourcing is right for their businesses, and he's established Oxys's methodology to migrate organizations to our outsourcing center in Costa Rica. Today he's going to provide you with an overview of that methodology, the game plan for first-time outsourcers. Just as a reminder for all attendees, should you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in your webinar panel chat area, and we'll make sure to address those questions at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Eric Libros. Eric?
Thank you, Yaslin, and welcome everyone to Outsourcing 101. Today's webinar is designed to help first-time outsourcers, regardless of the size or type of the company, understand the process that's involved in implementing an outsourcing solution. We will help you better understand what's involved in making a decision to outsource, and once you've made the decision to go forward, how to do outsourcing right. In order to do that, we're going to have to answer the 4 key questions that you see here. Is outsourcing right for my business? What should I outsource? Where should I outsource to? And lastly, how do I get started? In order to start with this discussion, I thought it would be helpful to put some perspective around the current state of the outsourcing industry and talk a little bit about its evolution. Outsourcing is now a well-established, mature business function that's been around for more than 20 years, and it's gone from the world of large global enterprises to now being accessible to companies of all sizes. As you can see from this statistic, 80% of large companies utilize outsourcing today in one form or another, led by certain functions like payroll, billing, accounts payable, and IT. But 58% of mid-sized companies and 43% of small companies currently use outsourcing. So outsourcing is not as well established in the small to mid-sized business sector, but it's definitely making its presence known. More importantly, is 73% of mid-sized companies are planning to expand their outsourcing services in the next 18 to 36 months. So what you're seeing is those companies that have been slower to adopt outsourcing are now looking at it as definitely a part of their business model and feel it's something that is accessible to them as an organization. One of the main drivers for this decision is that companies, in addition to looking for cost savings, is looking for organizational performance improvements and efficiencies that they can obtain through outsourcing. 63% of companies surveyed attributed organizational performance improvements and efficiencies to the outsourcing process. So clearly it's something that companies see as a benefit besides cost savings. But cost savings is the big allure, and companies have seen cost savings in labor costs that can exceed 50% compared to the U.S. labor costs. There are various markets that have emerged for outsourcing, but the leading one, the Asia-based market, clearly has the largest cost savings available, statistically showing it about 50% or in sometimes greater amounts. Other markets have emerged in the recent years. Latin America and Eastern Europe, considered nearshore markets, have emerged and also show considerable cost savings compared to U.S. labor markets. One of the reasons that the cost savings is closer to each other is because there's been some wage inflation taking place in the Asia markets, and also the value of the U.S. dollar has eroded somewhat compared to those currencies. So you're seeing some closer dollar savings between Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia, but Asia is still the leader. To understand the current state of the outsourcing industry, let's consider its evolution. The outsourcing industry began in the late 1980s, early 1990s, led by such business experts as Peter Drucker, Michael Hammer, and James Champy, who wrote the Industry Business Process Improvement Bible, Reengineering the Corporation. These principles led to the concept of the shared service center, where business operations were consolidated and standardized to drive performance and efficiency, and this led to the first outsourcing engagements. The first shared service centers for U.S.-based companies were primarily domestic, mostly due to concerns about the infrastructure and the workforce that was available in foreign markets. What we're referring to as Outsourcing 2.0 began in the mid to late 1990s. It was driven by the Y2K initiative, where companies were looking for lower cost resources to do some of the work related to updating the Y2K code, and they started to look at the Asia market, where there was a large workforce available at a lower cost who had the skills needed to provide these services. So essentially the outsourcing industry was established in that mid to late 90s period, focused primarily in the Asia market. Outsourcing 3.0 began about 5 or 6 years ago and has established the nearshore model focused in regions like Latin America and Eastern Europe. Advances in infrastructure in these markets, as well as an emerging workforce located in those markets who had good language skills and had experience working with multinationals, has driven this change. So you've seen now 3 different periods of time for outsourcing evolve over time, and each of them has taken on somewhat of a different tone in terms of how the model would be implemented. There's a couple of terms that are used sometimes interchangeably in these discussions: shared services and outsourcing, and I thought it would be helpful to provide a definition of each one and so we understand what the differences are. Shared services is provided by an internal entity, also known as a captive entity, and it's typically used to standardize business processes, systems, and controls across multiple operating entities within an organization. Generally, you find shared services in use by larger organizations that have multiple global operations, and they're using that to consolidate, standardize, and get more efficient. Outsourcing, on the other hand, is provided by a third party where the functions were previously performed by internal staff, often at an offshore location. Typically, what you're finding are transactional back office functions being established in the outsourcing model, although in recent years we've seen many other functions, some considered more strategic, being part of the outsourcing model as well. The goal of both models is to reduce operating costs through labor arbitrage and a greater economy of scale, as well as increasing efficiencies through standardization and automation. But we've also seen other benefits emerge over time through the shared services and outsourcing models. For example, cost-effective access to specialized skills. A lot of organizations sometimes are required to bring in specialized skills or knowledge to support a specific function or type of technology, for example, and they've had to pay very costly amounts to attain those skills. In this regard, shared services and outsourcing is provide access to those skills at a much lower cost. Another benefits that's come out of the shared services outsourcing model is the ability to establish a well-designed business continuity plan. Often when you have diverse or decentralized operations and you consolidate them into one location, the challenge there is what happens if an event happens in those locations. By having shared services and outsourcing, you're able to balance your operating model a little bit and have resources available in multiple locations to support the overall business because they have a perspective on the overall business. But one of the main benefits that come out of this type of model, both shared services and outsourcing, is having a higher level of visibility and accountability over the operations that take place in your business, typically through the establishment of service levels and performance metrics that define what transactional activities are happening in the business, when they should happen, and how well you're doing against those standards. In organizations today, typically, you find when something is done in-house, you may have service levels and performance metrics, although that's even relatively uncommon. But what you do find is that even if they're there, there's not necessarily a large amount of accountability held to those standards. When you establish an outsourcing operation, for example, well, these are now contractual standards that give the end client the control over what's happening in those activities. And in the shared service, they clearly have much more visibility over those types of activities. So now that we've established the baseline, let's start by asking and answering the key questions, starting with, is outsourcing right for my business? To start to answer the question, you really need to answer a number of other questions that should be posed as part of the decision-making process. Some of these questions are financial in nature, such as, do I need to reduce my operating costs, or are my competitors taking advantage of outsourcing to lower their costs? Are they, in other words, gaining a competitive advantage by using a lower cost model to support the same operations that I'm doing at a higher cost? So those type of financial questions are often key drivers for the decision that a company makes to look at outsourcing. Other questions are more operationally focused, such as, do I currently have operational issues that are affecting my ability to perform within my business? Do I need flexibility or scalability in my operating model? These are examples of questions that companies are asking themselves because they may have challenges internally within their organization, and as a result, they're struggling to perform a function effectively, and there may be impacts across that go beyond the internal operation, affecting customers, affecting revenues, etc. Flexibility and scalability is another key example of that. In other words, do you have a seasonal business that requires you to ramp up and down? Do you need the ability to adjust to economic changes? Outsourcing is one of the solutions that gives you that flexibility and scalability, and it's designed to help address some of these operational issues. Another key aspect of outsourcing comes in when you look at the need to bring in new technologies, talents, or skills. In many cases, for an organization to do that, it's a very costly proposition and very time-consuming, and also brings inherently a good deal of risk in trying to implement some of these solutions. A recent example that's occurring in business is the advent of social media, which has really changed the way customers buy and the way you communicate with them and the way you market your products. So these type of new technologies require a company to dramatically change the way it approaches its customer, and requires technologies and certain type of skills in order to support them. Having a strong understanding of SEO, for example, is a good example of the type of skill that's needed in an organization that probably wasn't needed 4 or 5 years ago. Well, when you have access to these skills and technology, they may come at a high cost, and the implementation can be difficult. Outsourcing is one way of providing access to these skills and minimizes the risk at a lower cost, because you're now basically getting the vendor to provide them, and they should have access to them as well. Other questions are related to more specific or unique requirements in your business. One example would be if you have certain type of regulatory issues that you have to address. If you're operating under regulatory compliance concerns, and you may have issues within your business that affect your ability to perform under those controls and guidelines. Well, with an outsourcing model, in essence, you may make this issue somebody else's problem. In other words, you go to a provider that has a well-controlled environment, and it's certified through such things as SSA 16s, also formerly known as SAS 70s, and that basically attests to the fact that their certifications are in place regarding the controls in their environment. It mitigates some of the risks that you maybe have to address through your regulatory compliance concerns, and you do it basically without having to invest anything on your end. Other examples, as we talked about, would be disaster or business continuity, needing to have another location to support business activities. We've had many clients actually express that as one of the key drivers that have made them look at the decision for outsourcing much more closely. There are many factors that companies look at when considering to employ outsourcing in its business model. A recent study by HFS Research and KPMG highlights the broad range of factors that go into this decision. Cost savings is clearly the leading driver, with 86% of all companies who were surveyed listing the cost savings as the main factor in their decision to outsource. If you look at the chart, it's the factor that's listed at the bottom, and the chart is broken down by showing on the left-hand side in green the small to mid-market business sector perspective, and the large enterprise perspective to the right. But other factors were considered nearly as important for many organizations. What you're seeing is that companies were looking at other things besides just cost savings to drive the decision to go into outsourcing. Leading the fray there were things like greater operational flexibility, increased operational effectiveness, the standardization of process, and as we talked about, some of the regulatory compliance requirements. These factors were equal to, or in some cases close to, the amount of consideration that were driving companies to consider outsourcing. And in particular, an interesting note is that the small to mid-market sector actually considered these more important in many cases factors than the cost savings that they could obtain, which you wouldn't expect. You'd be thinking that mid-market companies are looking first and foremost at cost savings, but as you can see, operational flexibility and increased operational effectiveness, as well as compliance, were factors that were equal to or larger than the amount of companies that surveyed that indicated cost savings was the primary driver. Conversely, there's many concerns that are highlighted by executives in making this transition. Aux's experience, supported by many studies, show that some of the main factors that give business executives pause in going to outsourcing run the range of different types of thoughts, ranging from operational to political to organizational to cultural. So some of the common themes that we hear from organizations are the ability to manage risk, the loss of control, the ability to implement a solution, or the ability to manage a remote solution, a remote operation. The loss of tribal knowledge, kind of the internal knowledge that people in your organization obtain that may not be documented but are really key to how an organization operates. And one of the other factors that's commonly expressed is political or employee backlash, the concern that's expressed by people that you're not going to, you're going to be outsourcing and it's viewed as a very negative type of situation. These, what you see here, are consistent with the experience of many of the companies who have successfully gone on to establish outsourcing and offshore operations. So it's important to note that before you say it won't work here, you really should look at the reasons for your thinking and determine how valid and true they are. And if they are valid, are there issues that you can mitigate through other types of activities? But note that while you may have these concerns, other companies have gone on to successfully establish outsourcing in their business model and have been able to overcome them. Through our years of helping companies migrate to both shared services and outsourcing operations, AUXIS has developed a cost savings roadmap that's consistently delivered the results that you see here. So for a business that's looking for cost savings, that needs to achieve cost savings, outsourcing becomes a lot easier decision, because what you're looking at is 25 to 50% of available labor arbitrage savings should be something that you could obtain. What that is basically telling you is through an outsourcing model, you're probably going to be able to achieve labor cost savings that range from 25 to 50% over your current costs today. That's a significant number that's giving people a lot of thought about why and why they want to do outsourcing and if it's right for their business. But there's additional savings that aren't always appreciated or understood when you go into this type of model. Through our experience, what we've seen is an additional 15 to 30% of cost savings is available through operating efficiency that occurs over time. So typically when you come in, you implement the solution and you have the labor savings that ranges from 25 to 50%. But then as the organization matures and you start to stabilize the operation and you start to look at ways to improve the business, an additional 15 to 30% typically becomes available. So now you're talking about cost savings that can achieve maybe even up to 50 to 80% of what your original costs were. An additional 5 to 10% can be available through what we call cross-company leverage. Cross-company leverage really talks about the fact of something we mentioned previously, which is that sometimes you have to bring in highly expensive resources that bring certain skills or knowledge within your organization, or you have to layer a management layer into the business that is required but is costing you a lot given the size of the organization that you're running. Through cross-company leverage, what you're able to do essentially is to spread that cost across multiple organizations. So instead of, for example, having to pay 100% of an FTE with a specialized skill, you may only have to pay 20% of that cost as that resource is made available to other organizations as well. Cross-company leverage is a key benefit, but it's one that comes over time and requires the maturity of an organization to establish that and realize that they don't necessarily need the full-time resource, they just need the knowledge when they need it. Of course, the savings that we've talked about, particularly the labor arbitrage, is mostly going to be available through an offshore model. The 25 to 50% labor arbitrage savings that you see, in all likelihood, will not be available through a domestic outsourcing model. You may see some savings, you probably will see some savings depending upon where this is located, but it's in all likelihood it's not going to achieve the level of an offshore model. The other issue to consider is if you are looking to go to outsourcing and you are concerned about the political impact of going to an outsourcing model, what is your alternative? Well, typically what companies are doing today is if they need to reduce their costs, they're doing layoffs. Well, layoffs ultimately can have a very negative effect on a business, putting a major strain on existing operations and the people doing that operations, and often can become detrimental to your business. And I would venture to say that while there's political negativity coming from outsourcing, I don't think you gain much political capital from conducting layoffs either. So it's a decision you make as to which would be the most effective solution to your business. Another thing to consider when looking at outsourcing is companies typically want to outsource some of the activities because they feel they can gain improvements from those often inefficient operations. The reality is that if a process is working well, in all likelihood, a company is not going to be inclined to outsource it regardless of the cost savings. So that's been our experience, and in the end of the day, what you're really seeing is the driver, while it is cost savings, as we've talked about, operational improvement is probably the main factor that's making a company either look at outsourcing and also making the decision to implement it. So if the answer is yes to outsourcing, there are some additional questions that you should be asking yourself before you proceed with the decision to move forward. Some of these questions include, what am I looking to gain? Is it cost savings? Is it efficiency? Is it performance improvement? If it's about cost savings, am I confident that I'm going to achieve the savings? Do I really understand what I'm paying today, and do I understand how that will be able to be lowering my cost by going to this model? If it's efficiency or performance improvement, how will I measure the benefits? Very often an organization has very poor visibility over its transactional activity and the performance of the business. So as a result, if you go into outsourcing, how do you know that you've gained the benefits that you're looking for? I think it's something you need to investigate before you make the decision to go into outsourcing to determine what you really want to accomplish. Have you assessed the impact to the business both operationally and culturally? Do you understand by taking a function and moving it offshore or moving it to an outsourcing operation, what will be the impact to the organization? What will be the impact to my customers? What will be the impact to any third parties that I have to deal with? How do I address the issues internally? How do I communicate the change and why? These are all things that should be discussed and considered before you make the decision to go into outsourcing. And then what are the risks and how do I mitigate them? There clearly are going to be some risks if you move a function into somebody else's control. But again, as we've seen, many companies have done it and done it successfully. So you need to understand the risks going in and have a strategy of how to mitigate them in advance before you make the move. Really, what this is all saying is having well-defined expectations and outcomes is critical to the success of an outsourcing function. Know what you're getting into, have a plan of what you want to accomplish, and have a plan of how to address any issues or concerns that come up. So now that you made the decision to outsource some of your operations, now comes the next key question. What should I outsource? The Duke University study that was highlighted in one of the earlier slides previously references some of the leading functions that small to mid-sized business executives were considered outsourcing. As you can see from this chart, most of these functions are in the technology or finance and accounting or customer service areas. Things like applications development and maintenance or ADM, IT infrastructure, contact centers, finance and accounting. Those are the leading areas that companies were looking to outsource. And they're typically functions that larger companies had already migrated to outsourcing, making them far more mature targets for outsourcing providers and making them easier for an organization to know that they can successfully make the move. A closer look at the business side shows that the leading functions that are currently being outsourced are typically in the transactional areas, things like payroll, accounts payable, purchasing, accounts receivable, general accounting. If you look at this chart, the right-hand side of the screen in green highlights the percentages of functions that are outsourced currently today as compared to some of the other ways that they're being handled, whether it's in-house or through shared services operations. So this chart highlights some of the key functions, and transactional is definitely a leader in the perspective of what functions are being outsourced. But as you can see, there are a number of what's considered more strategic functions that are part of the outsourcing world as well. Things like financial planning and analysis, things like management reporting, business analytics. Companies are outsourcing these today as well, so it's not just a pure transactional play that goes into outsourcing. Obviously, there's a benefit that companies are looking for, whether it's lower cost, whether it's those resource accessibilities that we talked about, or whether it's just general improvement in the process. But as your organization matures, you would probably look to start analyzing whether these functions make sense for you as well. But for a first-time outsourcer, you really should be looking at activities that are easier to migrate, easier to control, and easier to work with. And there's a number of studies that we've seen over the years, and certainly ones that we've seen through our experience, that highlight the operational continuum from low to high levels of complexity within an organization. And if you look at the chart that we're about to display, you'll see some of the activities that probably are better targets for first-time outsourcers. So starting with the back office, basic rules-based transactional activities, things like accounts payable, things like invoicing, things like general accounting, meaning reconciliations, journal entry processing, etc., payroll, telemarketing, IT operations. These are areas that essentially within a business they just have to work. And if they work, there's really not a lot of management and complexity involved beyond that. So if you have an ability to take a function like these and migrate them to someone else who can provide a higher level of service and allow you to not have to be as focused on it, it makes itself a good target for outsourcing. But there are other activities that are more external, also considered customer-facing activities, that also lend itself to outsourcing and is seen quite commonly in the outsourcing world. Things like customer service, order processing, collections, human resource administration, or applications development and maintenance. All areas that companies are looking at and are conducting outsourcing today. They have a little bit higher level of complexity and risk because they're no longer just an internal operation, but they are very transactional in nature, and as a result probably will lend themselves to an outsourcing model. So at the end of the day, if you're a first-time outsourcer, this is probably the bucket that you want to be looking at as a place to start. Corporate functions, areas that are primarily internally operational but have greater impact and greater complexity, are areas that would probably not be the best place to start, but again, you're seeing some of these happening within the outsourcing industry today. So as we've talked about, financial planning and administration, treasury, tax administration, regulatory compliance, these are examples of functions that would probably in that next tier, and I would recommend starting with the back office processing activities first and then ultimately looking at some of these corporate functions once your outsourcing model matures. The more strategic functions, things defined as driving higher business value, things such as creative marketing, research and development, risk management, anything related to business and technology strategy, are probably not great targets for a first-time outsourcer and probably not something you should be considering if you're making this decision. But again, it's important to note that all of these areas that you see here are areas that are being made available. So something that you might want to look at down the road, but probably not from a first-time perspective. To kind of summarize this, some of the key considerations for first-time outsourcing decisions would be activities that involve lower risk. So they have a limited impact on external and strategic operations. They should be fairly rules-based and transactional, and something that is not going to be a complicated thing to move to another organization. They should require limited management oversight. This is an interesting one because what you find is a lot of the activities that you see in that back office processing bucket, while they are rules-based and transactional in nature, you're often spending a lot of management cycles dealing with them. And the reason for that is probably because there's issues that need to be addressed, and they, like I said, they have to work, but if they don't work well, management needs to get involved and has to address some of it. Well, one of the side benefits that comes out of an outsourcing model is that you're now freeing up management cycles to work on more higher value activities, as they don't typically have to spend as much time focused on resolving AP issues, for example, or dealing with customer service issues. They can spend more time involved in a higher level function. That's a side benefit, and it's one that companies often achieve. But when you're looking at what to outsource, look for things that shouldn't. They may do require high levels of management oversight, but they shouldn't. Lastly, another thing that you should be looking for are the required levels of skills and experience. Very often, as we go into this type of analysis with our clients, we find that a lot of activities that are lower, that should require lower levels of skills and experience, are often being done by higher level people. In some cases, even management level people are performing transactional activities. This is because as companies have kind of evolved over time, jobs get blended, the lines get blurred between management and transactional activities, and very often you're taking people who are being paid a much higher salary to do work that typically should require a much lower salary. So in looking for the opportunities, you should look at the jobs that require a lower level of skill and experience that may be being currently done by people that are performing or being paid, frankly, at a higher level. So that's an important note that companies should be looking for. So let's talk about some of the traditional areas that may seem right for outsourcing, as we have talked about. Starting with, let's look at accounts payable. Is it transactional or is it core? Well, the answer is it depends. If your business is doing traditional, standard G&A related accounts payable, it can certainly be considered a transactional, non-core activity. Basically, you have vendors, you have to pay those vendors for goods and services that your company uses. You have to pay them in a reasonable time period. The volumes are not such that they're high demand, and you're able to manage this process effectively. And as I said earlier, it just needs to work. In that case, accounts payable would be considered a very good target for an outsourcing operation. But in some businesses, accounts payable takes on a much more strategic and complex tone. For example, there are some businesses that incorporate drop ship in their revenue and order processing cycles. So for example, if you're a retail distribution type company and you have customers who place orders through a drop ship methodology, you're actually buying the product from the vendor, and the vendor is responsible for shipping the product to the customer. In that type of approach, accounts payable becomes a lot more strategic and a lot more core, because what you're doing there is you're now affecting revenue, you're affecting customer service, there are timing concerns, there are quality concerns. These are things that take on a whole different tone. So it's not to say that that type of accounts payable can or shouldn't be outsourced. It's that it just takes on a more level of complexity and strategic place in your organization, and you just need to be aware of it when you make the decision and properly plan for it. Another example with an AP would be timing. There are certain companies that get significant discounts available from vendors if they're able to take advantage of the turnaround time in the terms provided by those vendors. Well, if you do not have a well-established process and you're not able to take advantage of the timing, you may lose out on a significant amount of dollars that could reduce your overhead. So timing is an important factor, and again, adds a layer of complexity and a layer of more strategic value to an accounts payable function. Poor performing functions, typically, as we've talked about, they would be considered good targets for outsourcing. But is that always going to be the case? It depends. It depends on what the root causes are for the poor performance and if these can be addressed through this process. Migrating a poor performing process without a plan to improvement is just going to result in a poor performing process being done somewhere else. You're not really gaining much there, are you? We recommend that you start with a process that you understand and know what it takes to do the job, and if there are issues, you understand what the root causes are to those issues and have a plan to correct them. Work with the vendor to resolve those issues, and then when you make the migration, those poor performing areas should be able to be addressed much more effectively. Some other key considerations for first-time outsourcers include are the needed knowledge and skills available. You know, in some cases, there's certain types of knowledge or tools that are being used in an organization that may not be a standard operating platform. You know, example would be an industry-specific solution or proprietary systems that you've developed yourself. Well, understand that when you go into an outsourcing operation, the knowledge of these non-standard operating platforms or tools is probably not going to be available from the outsourcer. So one of two things is going to take place here. You're going to have to spend time training the outsourcer on these platforms to make sure that they have access to them and they understand how to use them and understand how to apply them in their organization. Or you're going to end up paying more for them because the vendor has to go out and do that themselves or find more highly skilled resources to do a job. So it's important to understand the level of knowledge and skill needed to perform a job. Another example of this would be language skills. If your business requires a certain level of multilingual skills such as English and Spanish, you need to be sure that when you make the move, those language skills are available and at what cost. So if you're looking for English and Spanish, a nearshore model incorporating Latin America will probably be a good place to look because those language skills are readily available. If you're looking at Asia and you want to find Spanish speakers in an Asian market, yeah, you can find them, but in all likelihood, you're going to probably end up paying more for them. So we recommend that you understand the scope, and again, work with the vendor to try to determine what makes the most sense for you. Can you measure it? That's another important consideration that you have to take into account. Do you have well-established and clearly defined performance metrics? As we've talked about, there's probably not a good baseline of data that's available in your business, and typically as a result of that, you don't have a good understanding of what your current levels of performance are and what they need to be and how to measure it going forward. So a key benefit of outsourcing is to establish these type of controls, but that only works if the data is available and you have a baseline to start with and something that you can measure ongoing. What we also find is that there are often myths and legends that occur in an organization regarding the performance levels of a business. I've had a number of clients who express to me what the transactional levels that they perform are, and then when you actually do the math, you see that, well, they don't have enough transactions to equal those numbers. So unfortunately, there's not a good understanding of the levels of transactional activity that takes place, and these myths and legends can kind of dilute the measurements that you're trying to put into place and the performance expectations that come as a result of that. We also see through some of these myths and legends sometimes the perspective of after you've made the move, you kind of forget about why you made the move in the first place. It's kind of like the guy who broke up with his girlfriend and then several years later keeps thinking back about that girlfriend and all the reasons you broke up with her you forgot about, and she starts to look better and better every day. Well, you have to understand why you made the decision, why the decision is happening, and why the decision needs to remain in place, and don't allow the myths and legends or the allure of lost love kind of draw you back. Okay, so now we've made the decision that we want to outsource, and we started to figure out what we want to outsource. So now comes the next key question: where do I outsource to? To provide a basic understanding, let's first review the various geographic models that are available. The first geographic model that we'd like to talk about is domestic outsourcing, also known as in-country outsourcing, and this is where the services are performed in the same country in which they're received. There are several North American destinations that have established themselves over the years as leading outsourcing destinations. As you see here, Toronto, San Antonio, and St. Louis are considered three of the leading destinations. There's an organization called Tholins, which provides an annual list of the top 100 outsourcing destinations, and those three that you see here were the North American destinations that appeared on the list. What you're also seeing is there are a number of other areas within the country that are starting to look to provide various tax incentives for companies to migrate their operations there. So you're starting to see other sites emerge in the United States. Rural sourcing is another term that's often thrown around, where you have lower cost resources that may be available, and you have the ability to migrate operations to some of those lower cost resources and gain some tax incentives to go along with it. The downside of some of that may be the availability of talent in those markets and the ability to retain talent in those markets, simply because you have to pull people into the market in order to support what you need done. The offshore outsourcing model is generally defined as when services are performed in a country where there are significant differences in proximity and time zones. So for the U.S., Asia becomes the offshore market, and the top sites there, according to Tholins, are India, the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. And as you know, there's definitely a time difference issue that's being dealt with in some of these markets, and it takes quite a long time to get to them if you need to travel. In the nearshore model, the services are generally performed in another country, which is typically in close proximity and has similar time zones to the country receiving the services. So for the United States, Latin America has become a nearshore destination, with Costa Rica, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina the leading nearshore locations according to the Tholins list. For Europe, nearshore has typically become Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe has emerged for most of the Western Europe countries as a nearshore destination, but also Ireland has emerged as a location for that as well. So the top European locations include Ireland, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. The chart that you see here, while somewhat subjective, it gives you a good perspective on the relative strengths and weaknesses of each geographic model. So clearly, as you can see, domestic outsourcing is one that has a lot of benefits. But in the end, the bottom line is the bottom line. And you're in all likelihood likelihood going to be paying anywhere up to 40 to 50% more in this model than through outsourcing. So it depends on what you're looking for, but clearly there are a lot of benefits through domestic outsourcing, but cost savings is probably not going to be one of them. Nearshore offers a lot of advantages compared to the offshore model, with the most significant ones being the travel and proximity, travel times and proximity, and time zone compatibility, which all pretty much are the same as if you were working within the U.S. There are other benefits as well, some less well known that you typically see, particularly when compared to an offshore model. Things like cultural compatibility, things like economic stability, things like security of the operation, risks to intellectual property. Nearshore locations, particularly Latin America, tend to be stronger in these areas than the offshore models. An interesting one that we found over time is the power and telecom infrastructure. While the United States clearly is a leader in these areas, pretty much throughout the Latin American market, there's been major investments within those markets for power and telecom infrastructure. So you're finding very robust infrastructure available in those markets, in some cases rivaling or even exceeding what's available in the U.S. In some of the Asia markets, this has been a challenge, and there are many stories that you can read about in press and through the media that highlight some of the concerns related to power and telecom infrastructure in some of the Asia markets, stories of rolling blackouts, stories of organizations that haven't been able to get power for periods of time when telecom is not available because of wait times to get circuits, things like that. These are all key factors when you want to look at when you're making the decision for where you want to outsource. Clearly, from an offshore perspective, the labor costs and the availability of a large labor pool are the dominant factors of why people look there, but the trade-offs can come from other areas. When comparing nearshore to offshore, the various pros and cons, what you see here are some of the main ones that people look at. So clearly geographic proximity, time zone, these are all benefits of a nearshore model. But time and travel costs is another one that people don't always take into account when they first make this type of decision. What you're seeing is for an organization to make the decision to outsource, you're probably going to want to spend time in the outsourcer's location, and conversely, the outsourcer needs to spend some time in your location in order to make this process work most effectively. Well, travel time to Latin America can be anywhere from as little as 2 to 3 hours to maybe 5 or 6 hours. If you're trying to travel to Asia, we all know the travel times that you're incurring. It could be 21, 24, 28 hours. We've seen all of these different times as factors in it, and the cost to travel is much, much higher than it is to go to Latin America. So some of these factors are critical ones when you're considering the decision to outsource. And if you're looking at labor costs solely, you're probably going to go Asia first because you're going to see 20 to 30% lower costs there. But aside from that, a lot of benefits are available through the nearshore model, and nearshore has emerged as a very viable alternative for a large range of organizations. So now comes the real key question: how do I get started? Auxis has had extensive experience migrating many organizations, large and small, to shared services and outsourcing operations in various geographic markets, ranging from the domestic to Latin America and Asia. The game plan that we're about to present is our approach to how to implement a successful outsourcing operation, and will help to ensure that you can gain the most benefits from the move, help you manage your risks, and establish a strong operation ongoing. So let me now present our game plan for first-time outsourcers. The game plan is a multi-phase process that builds upon the prior activities to ensure that an effective and well-controlled migration takes place and that there's a stable ongoing operation. The first phase in the process involves evaluating the opportunity, and this incorporates a number of different things that get done, primarily to drive a cost savings analysis to determine if the opportunity even exists. The first thing that we do is we analyze your current organization, really looking at the roles and responsibilities and activities being performed in that organization. Essentially, we dig into the activities and the people performing the job. What are the experience and skill levels of those people? What's required to do the job? And we end up doing a one-to-one position mapping using a baseline of outsourcing positions that we have in our operating model. That one-to-one position mapping allows you to say if the job A is being performed by this resource here, what would the resource be in our model, and what's the difference in the cost of that resource? But we also look at the experience levels that are required. As we talked about earlier, there's sometimes positions are being done by people who are higher value or higher cost than they should be for a certain role. We do what we call position leveling, which means you look at a transactional activity that's being performed and you say, while this is being performed by this person here, I really need this level of experience to do it, and I may be able to lower the level of the position. That allows you to reduce your cost and allows you to therefore gain additional savings beyond just the straight labor arbitrage. So position leveling and position mapping are key activities that take place. Once we've put that model together, we review it with the client, and the client then signs off on the mapping that we've developed and agrees that this mapping would work for them in their organization. We then conduct the cost savings analysis, which is literally the difference between what you pay here and what you would pay through an outsourcing model. So in the cost savings analysis, you look at the labor savings through a couple of different ways. There is your current cost, which essentially is going to be the salary, the benefits, and any taxes that you're paying, and any other incentives that might be included in the job, what we call the fully loaded cost, compared to the labor cost through an outsourced provider. The outsourced provider should provide you with a cost that includes the following: their labor cost, their regulatory charges, their benefits, their facilities costs, their supporting infrastructure costs, all the things that basically are needed to put a person in a seat in order to do a job, as well as their margin. So those two need to be compared. And as you can see, there's a lot of elements that go into the provider's labor cost that's different from the end client labor cost. Typically, as we've discussed, once you've done that analysis, you should see a savings that ranges anywhere from 25 to 50% within a function. It may not be at all positions, but overall across a function, the labor savings typically should be in that range. One of the things that we do not include in this analysis, but you should be aware of as an additional benefit, is the availability of additional savings through lower fixed and variable costs to your organization. Fixed costs are things like facilities charges. If you're moving a whole group of people, you may be able to reduce some of your current facilities costs. Rent, building maintenance, etc. Things that you may be able to eliminate because you don't have the need to have the facility in place. Those are sometimes available, sometimes not, but will always be available are the variable costs. So typically you're gonna have costs for things like computer equipment, telecom, training, human resources, recruiting, attrition replacement costs, things like that that are always going to be part of your operating model. Well, when you move those jobs to an outsourcing provider, it becomes part of their responsibility, their model, and no longer is a cost to you. So there are additional savings that you may not realize that are available over and above that 25 to 50% that we talked about. The other thing that's done during this process when we're analyzing the whole opportunity is defining what the contracting model would look like. And that goes beyond just the legal terms and conditions. There are a number of different ways you can structure a deal and how that deal will be priced according to what makes the most sense for the client. The three most commonly implemented models are fixed fee, time and materials, and transactional based. In the fixed fee model, you're essentially paying a flat amount for a service being provided. So for example, if you outsource accounts payable, you would pay whatever the fee is that you've negotiated for the performance of that accounts payable function within your organization. Regardless of the number of people doing it, regardless of the transactional volumes that are taking place, it's a flat amount that you're paying for accounts payable. That may be a monthly amount, it may be an annual amount, it can depend on how you structure it. In a time and materials model, it's more oriented towards the number of people doing the job. So typically what you're doing there is if you have 10 people in accounts payable today and you move 10 people to the outsource provider, you're going to pay a monthly or an hourly or even an annual rate for those individuals, and the cost of that is determined at the FTE level. So in that regard, the provider is giving you essentially what's similar to a staff augmentation model because they're essentially providing people at a fixed cost. In the third solution, the transactional-based model, that's an interesting one because essentially what you're doing there is you're paying on a per transaction basis. So you're really paying for what you're using. If you process 1,000 invoices, you pay one amount. If you process 10,000 invoices, you pay another amount. So at the end of the day, it's easily manageable from a cost perspective, and it can go up or down depending upon the volume of transactions that occur in your business. This is good for seasonal businesses. This is so you don't have to worry about the number of people in the organization, and it ultimately becomes a very easy way to manage your budget and your projected costs. The challenge with this is that, as we've talked about, when you go into an outsourcing model, transactional-based solutions are not ones that are easy to define simply because there's no great baseline of data to determine what transactions are taking place. Myths and legends don't work here. You need to have a real number, and that number needs to be understood by all parties and an expectation set. Other things have to be applied as well, such as timing, such as approval levels, and the business rules that are established around a transaction. So when you go into this, a transactional-based model may sound interesting, but it's probably harder to implement and may take longer to implement. So typically what we find is either a fixed fee or a T&M approach is a great way to start, get you into the business, establish the baseline, and ultimately you can migrate to a transactional-based approach. We suggest talking to your vendor about this and deciding what makes the most sense for you, and understanding if they're flexible to change the model based on how things evolve. The next phase of the operation is the design phase, where we basically go in and do a functional deep dive on your current business process and what's happening within that process. So here, beyond what we did before, which is really looking at the roles and responsibilities and the cost, now we're documenting in detail what the process is that's taking place. How a transaction flows through your business, what are the controls, what are the business rules, who touches those transactions, how often they take place. These are all things that are documented, and this is done through a detailed process walkthrough where we're interviewing key subject matter experts within your organization. We may be shadowing the people doing the job, but at the end of the day, we're really understanding what it is that you're doing to complete a transactional activity in your business. We then go back and review this with you to make sure that we've captured everything, and we all agree that the as-is model that we've defined is correct. Once we've done that, we look at the to-be model and design what the end organization would look like. This includes what are the organization, what are the roles, what are the tools that will be implemented, what are the business rules, and what are the operational handoffs. Operational handoffs is a key one because very often it's a neglected part of the analysis. In many cases, a function is not going to be completely done by an outsourced provider. They may take it to a certain point, transition it back to the end client, who interacts with the transaction and then sends it back to the outsourced provider for completion. An example of this could be an approval level within an accounts payable function where any invoice that's below a certain amount, the provider may have the ability, once they've done their three-way match, to process the transaction to completion. But if it's above a certain amount, you may want to have somebody intercede on this, review it, approve it, and determine what the timing should be for payments. So those type of handoffs are key elements in defining how an outsourcing model should work, and really needs to be worked very closely between the provider and the end client to lay those out in advance and define them very clearly. This brings us to the discussion over how the methodology for designing a to-be model and how things should be implemented. There's a commonly used term in the industry called lift and shift. With lift and shift, basically what you're doing is you're taking the existing operation and you're moving it to another provider who's essentially not changing it and just implementing it as is. This is probably the easiest way to conduct a migration. It's probably the lowest risk way to conduct a migration, and it's probably the fastest way to conduct a migration. Having said that, what you're not going to get are some of the benefits of efficiencies and improvements that happen up front. Another option is to go in and improve everything up front, look at ways to make performance and operational improvements, and implement a solution that's going to be different from what you were doing before, but should inherently have improvements built into it. While this may sound attractive, again, it's bringing a lot more complexity and time into the implementation process, and a certain degree of risk because you're changing the process. And if it's not well documented and well defined and well understood by all parties, there may be impacts that occur outside of a specific transaction, such as affecting a customer or a third party or even other departments in your organization that you haven't accounted for. So improve up front sounds good, but it may be a lot more complicated, and we probably don't recommend that for a first-time outsourcer. What we typically do is a hybrid model that really incorporates a little bit of both. Essentially, we move the model, we move the operation into our model. We don't make a lot of major changes, but we may do some organizational changes. We may change some of the roles, some of that position leveling that we talked about. The business rules and the handoffs may be defined that may try to streamline a process. And often we're going to implement automation into a process that may not exist today. For example, in many organizations today, reconciliation activities are done through Excel, and it's a very time-consuming and cumbersome process. We would typically implement an automated reconciliation tool that allows you to much more quickly, match items and reconcile them, and even when there aren't matches, it makes suggested matches that help you understand and facilitate the process of the reconciliation. Implementing that up front is a quick and painless way to gain some quick efficiencies without drastically changing the operation. So that hybrid approach, looking to incorporate some changes in some business rules without making a major overhaul to the process, is probably the safest and easiest way for a first-time outsourcer to proceed. One point I do like to make is to beware of black box outsourcing. Black box outsourcing is what I define as when a vendor comes in and says, I'm going to take over everything, I'm going to give you the processes, you're going to use my tools, all you have to do is give me the transactions, I'll process them, and you'll get the result out of it. This sounds great on paper, and it particularly sounds great for companies that are struggling to work within a function, but in my experience, this has been one that's very difficult to implement and manage ongoing, and I've seen in some cases clients who have implemented this solution have to bring it back very quickly because the process wasn't well thought out, didn't work effectively within their operation, and there were disconnects in terms of how the process should flow within the business. A lot of times there's communication issues that occur within that. So I suggest if you're thinking of black box outsourcing, you really take a close look at what's inside that black box, pick up the lid, look inside, and understand what you're getting yourself into. And in all likelihood, you should be working very closely with the vendor to find a solution that works for you. Once you finish the design phase, we go into implementation. So at this point, what we've done is we've basically laid out what the model should look like. We've documented what we need in terms of the processes. We've gone through the process of hiring staff, and we've built out the facilities to make sure that that everything works when people show up to actually do the job. This is an often overlooked piece of the puzzle that needs to be addressed. Facilities design and implementation is critical because nothing more frustrating than flipping a switch and it doesn't work. If you don't have the right connectivities established, if you don't have proper bandwidth, if you don't have tools in place, and you're struggling to get that happening at the last minute, there's a lot of opportunities for error. But once that's done, you go into training and migration. In training and migration, several things happening concurrently. You have the SLAs are finalized, the service level agreements are finalized. We've defined what the metrics are and how to measure them. This is communicated throughout, and there's a communication process that occurs throughout the organization. Training occurs here. Typically during the deep dive, we're developing what's called standard operating procedures. These are detailed, step-by-step desktop procedures of how a transaction takes place, what you do, who does it, and when it's being done. These standard operating procedures are great training tools, but they also serve as a great tool for ongoing updating and maintenance within an organization as people reference them to make sure that they're doing the process effectively. So the development and implementation of standard operating procedures is a key part of this process. Once you get through the training, you come to what we call the soft go live. The soft go live occurs when the new outsourcing staff is providing actual production. They're working on real transactions, but typically they're not necessarily doing it at the volume or level that's aligned with the service level agreement. There's additional support that's being provided by the client, a kind of a hand-holding activity, or what we call hypercare, to support the performance and to identify any issues or concerns. That process goes on for a period of time, and then the operation stabilizes, and ultimately you go into full production. When you get to full production, essentially that's the point in time when you're transacting at the service level agreement volume, and you're expected to perform in accordance with it. Which brings us to the last phase, which is really not a phase but an ongoing process of continuous improvement. Throughout the process, we've talked about looking to create efficiencies. Well, efficiencies do typically occur over time. And as your business operations mature, you start to identify where that should occur. So there should be a regular set of performance monitoring both towards the SLA as well as any other metrics that give you a good idea of what's happening in the area of the business. So an example of an SLA could be number of invoices processed, but an operational metric, which is another data point that tells you how well the organization is doing, may be the timing around those invoices. Are we hitting the timelines that we've established? So reviewing both sets of data is critical to being able to effectively perform the process. As you start to work, there should be an incentive for both parties to get better, to get more efficient. So we typically recommend a gain share model that incorporates cost savings to the client and an improved margin to the provider simply by driving efficiencies into the operation. The investment that the provider should make is in providing that focus, that knowledge, and the implementation of tools that can drive improved performance, and in the end the vendor can get something out of it by reducing the number of people doing the job, but gaining an improved margin to do it. And ultimately the client gets the benefit of a lower cost. The end goal of all of this is to create a center of excellence, which is designed to have operations that take place around a realm of best practices that are pretty much industry standard. But it's important to note here that best practices are not one size fits all, and there needs to be a real-world perspective around how a process should work and what best practices should apply. We've seen many cases where an industry standard best practice really doesn't make sense to implement in an operation, or doesn't make sense to implement because the time and cost involved in implementing it may not result in enough of a benefit. So these are important things to consider, but the goal of all of this should be continuous focus on ongoing improvement. What you're seeing here is really the same approach that the game plan is highlighted, but put some timing around it, so it gives you an understanding of how long things take. So in the first case, the business case and the proposal and contracting model, that can take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, and it's really preceding the actual implementation of the process. The design phase, depending upon the level of complexity and the activities that are being done and the scope that's being managed, can take as little as 4 weeks and can take as long as 3 months. It really depends. There's a lot of different factors that come in, and you should work very closely with the vendor to define how long this process should take place. As you can see, during the design phase, staffing, facilities prep, and enabling technologies is being done concurrently with all the activities that you see above. When you get into training, well, that cycle can be anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, and again depends on the size, the scope, the complexities involved. But it's important not to short shrift the training. I've had clients basically ask me to take over something very quickly without a lot of understanding of the process and with limited amount of training, and while we've been able to get through it successfully, it was painful to get there for everybody. So I really recommend design and training not be short shrifted. They need to be done in a very disciplined manner. Hypercare typically is anywhere from 30 to 90-day cycle. Remember, hypercare is that phase when you're having kind of a ramp up to full production. There's additional guidance being provided by the end client, and what's happening here is there's support that's taking place. There may even be some concurrent staffing on both organizations as the provider ramps up and the end customer ramps down. These things are commonly occurred, and again, you need to have a full understanding of what that is. But when you get to the end of it, you should be at full production. You should be having regular communication with the vendor. You should be monitoring performance, and there should be an approach that focuses on continuous improvement. So, in summary, outsourcing is not something new. It's been around for a while. It's been around for more than 20 years that we've talked about, and there are many examples of the benefits that it's provided to companies, ranging from cost savings and performance improvements to business continuity, mitigation, and the ability to establish a more flexible business operation. Today, there are many more options available to businesses than ever before, both in terms of the scope of services as well as the size of the business that can benefit from them. So it's important to know that outsourcing is something that has worked and has worked well for a number of different organizations. But the key is to do outsourcing right. A good outsourcing relationship is one that essentially becomes an extension of your current staff, and the outsource provider is a true business partner rather than a vendor. There also needs to be a win-win relationship where both parties are equally benefiting and both parties are equally invested. Trying to do something on the cheap, trying to squeeze every dollar out of an outsourced provider, not necessarily the best way to go, particularly for a first-time outsourcer. You want to have a relationship with a vendor where the two of you clearly have something to gain from this, and there's a benefit to both parties. Lastly, you should know that you should have the confidence to act. It's been around for a while. It's been done successfully. There are a lot of areas that outsourcing has helped businesses solve a lot of operational issues, has given them access to new resources, new technologies, and the ability to gain and grow as a business. It's clearly part of today's business world, and outsourcing is not something that is no longer considered an outlier in business. For any business of any size, you should have the confidence to act and know that outsourcing can work for you as well. So thank you all for participating in this webinar. I appreciate the time, and I hope that you found it interesting. For participating in the webinar, we're also going to provide you with a white paper which provides much more details on the process, the approach, and the activities that are involved in effectively implementing an outsourcing operation in your business. Thank you again, and now if there's any questions, I'll be happy to entertain them.
Thank you, Eric. There are a few questions that are coming in from our attendees. The first one is, how does outsourcing affect the rest of the organization's culture?
It's a good question, and it's one that's it's hard to answer, but at the end of the day, the real answer to that is how that message is being communicated to the rest of the organization. If outsourcing is viewed as a punitive or a purely negative thing and it's not going to benefit the business, there's going to be a negative impact within the culture. So we strongly urge that there's a strong communication around it, that people understand what's coming and why, and that you also are forthright and honest about what the plans are, because otherwise these things take a life of their own, and a lot of people exaggerate or feel it's going to be a lot more difficult than it may be.
Okay, and our next question here is, how do you manage your vendor to ensure the services are being delivered as per agreement?
Okay. That's all about reporting and communication. So as we've talked about throughout this webinar, there's a lot of different metrics that need to be established. You establish the baseline metrics and a service level agreement is defined. We actually take it to a next level and develop what's called a service catalog, which basically defines by process the activities are being performed, who's responsible for those activities, in other words, where those handoffs take place, and what are the metrics around it. The metrics are sometimes contractual in nature, sometimes operational in nature, but all of those should be communicated back and forth between the vendor and the provider. The vendor and the client. Having regular scheduled meetings is an important part of the process, and typically what happens is at the beginning you should be talking every day. You should be talking every day about how things are going and making sure that things are in sync on both sides. Those meetings can start to stretch a little bit. Maybe they become every other day, then they become weekly or biweekly. But in all cases, there should be at least a monthly review of performance and communication around issues and a solid understanding. But in the end, in order for an effective outsourcing relationship to be established between a client and an end provider, there needs to be a strong reporting methodology and a lot of communication.
Okay, Eric, and our last question. Our last question here is, do you recommend any methodologies such as Six Sigma or ITIL to manage and improve performance?
I definitely recommend any or all of them, but in the context of what the operation is. So we typically are not slaves to any one methodology, but are really more about what makes the most sense. But we incorporate elements of Six Sigma, we incorporate elements of Lean, we incorporate elements of ITIL if it's an IT process into our operation as we do the design and the implementation and the ongoing performance improvement. So Lean, Six Sigma, all of these methodologies are important and should be incorporated into the model. It's a very well-established way to improve a business, and something that outsourcing should be incorporating as well. Any other questions?
Looks like there are no other questions. So with that, thank
Again,
you.
thank
Oh,
you all
sorry.
very much. Thank
Thanks,
you all very
Eric.
much. Thank you.
And to all of our attendees for joining us today, the replay link will be available and a copy of the presentation as well as the white paper will be sent to all attendees shortly. So enjoy the rest of your day.